Joe, it is great to have you on this morning. And that's really where I want to start with you. How would you categorize the situation that we're seeing play out in real time right now?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Morgan. It's great to be on your show. And I think that we are moving towards a military confrontation. I think that President Trump is being quite sincere with respect to his willingness to negotiate with the Iranians. The Iranian regime is in a weak position right now, perhaps in the weakest position that it's been in its 47-year reign. And it is unlikely that they will be able to accede to the demands that President Trump and the Western world, in fact, would like to see Iran agree to during these negotiations. And so I think we're headed towards a military confrontation.
Interesting. I mean, there's all different types of military confrontations, right? So when you hear reports of the possibility of targeted strikes that are contained, does that seem like the most likely option, at least in phase one?
I think that's absolutely right. I think you're not going to see boots on the ground. This is not a war that or a military. I don't think it's a war, period. I think that this is not going to evolve in a military confrontation that involves U.S. boots on the ground. The president has never said that. I don't think that's his intention, nor is that something that his party and his base would want to see. But that doesn't preclude the U.S. Or the president from being able to take consequential military action against the regime targets, and those targets would be initially, if we were to move in that direction, I think strikes against Iranian defensive positions, especially with respect to their missile capabilities, their command and control, and it could move quickly towards the remainder of their nuclear program. Remember that we took out a large part of their nuclear program. In fact, significant blows against their nuclear program in June. And there are plenty of targets within the IRGC, within the Iranian Navy, within the Iranian military, should we build up toward that kind of an escalation. But I don't see this as a prolonged confrontation that would involve in any way boots on the ground.
Okay. Can we look to Venezuela as a template for what we could see play out here in Iran? I guess what are the similarities? What are the differences?
Yeah, I think the difference is that Venezuela was an exceptionally performed surgical operation that took out, removed the leader, Maduro, from Venezuela in a very carefully planned, timed, and executed operation. An operation against Iran, especially with the nuclear program being one of the components, and ballistic missile sites may be key IRGC targets. That's a much more expanded target set. That would be a much more a lengthier and a much more deliberate operation in terms of the scope and the magnitude. So I think that's the big difference.
Okay.
This would, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in Venezuela, it was not regime change, right? I mean, you had the ousting of Maduro, but his number two ascended and so has been working with the U.S. in the midst of that. Are we talking about specifically regime change in Iran? And if so, who steps in if Khomeini steps out?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. First of all, it's not clear to me that we are targeting, we are going to have regime change as a specific condition for this operation. Now, if the Iranian regime is sufficiently weakened and an opposition movement were to be able to displace the regime, then a regime change may be a consequence of this operation, but I'm not sure that it is going to be a specified mission for this kind of an operation. However, your question with respect to who steps in is a tough one, because there's no organized opposition on the ground in Iran that would be able to move in conjunction with military strikes against various facilities there. And so you could end up in a scenario where the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, which is the Praetorian Guard of this regime, regime decides that in order to preserve itself, and it has huge economic interests in Iran, they may decide to take some kind of action on their own to oust the Ayatollah Khamenei and his theocratic autocracy that that the Iranian regime has created, and install themselves in some kind of position of power to govern over the country, perhaps making promises that they would eventually democratize or allow for some sort of free elections. That is a likely scenario. There are other options as well, but that's, in my opinion, a likely scenario.
Yeah, and just finally, quickly, how likely is it that we see more activity, retaliation by Iran in the midst of all of this in the Strait of Hormuz? Or in other ways? Or
in other parts, yes, exactly. So I think that their intent would be very likely, but I believe that the U.S. military is very well aware of that and would plan accordingly. So again, you saw the Iranians successfully launch strikes against Israel during the June war. I think they would try to do the same. They may try to expand that into the Straits of Hormuz. They may try to expand that into the Gulf countries that neighbor them, or even into Jordan. So none of that intent should come as a surprise. The question is, will we be able to preclude that from happening through our significant military assets that are in the region or on their way to the region right now?